Blessed is the one who subscribes to this YouTube channel. Remember the golden rule. Treat others as you want to be treated.
Welcome to Spirituality in Society.
Thank you for joining us on Spirituality in Society, brought to you by APM Assembly of People in Mission. Our vision is to love Yahweh God and all people. Our mission is to prioritize seeking Yahweh's God kingdom above all else. Let's get started.
Hey everyone, and welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today we are exploring something, pretty fascinating. It might totally turn how you think about church upside down. Ready for it?
Hit me with it.
Okay, so what if I told you the early church, like the really early church, might not have even had worship services, as we picture them today, I mean.
That's right. It's a question that's had scholar Tom Wadsworth digging for like 50 years.
50 years.
Yeah. And we're diving into some excerpts from his YouTube series today. He has uncovered some wild stuff.
Oh, I bet. Just think about this. Did you know that the word worship, how we use it, didn't even exist in the first century?
Nope, it didn't. And that leads us to what Wadsworth calls the worship anomaly.
Okay, the worship anomaly.
Right. When you really look closely at the New Testament, you notice it never uses those typical Greek words for worship to describe what early Christians were doing when they got together.
Wow, okay, so does that mean they weren't worshiping God? What were they actually doing then?
It's not that they weren't devoted to God at all, but how they expressed that devotion, that was radically different. They weren't looking at it through our 21st century lens, you know what I mean?
Yeah. So what would we see, if we could time travel back then and walk into one of those gatherings?
Okay, so picture a house church. No pews, no fancy stage, and definitely no rock band.
Right. Yeah.
Instead, just a small group of people intensely focused on building each other up.
That's definitely not the image I usually get when I think church. So if they weren't having worship services, what were those words that got translated that way?
Well, there are a couple of big ones. First, there's proskuneo.
Proskuneo.
Yeah, and it literally means to prostrate yourself, like bowing down face to the ground in front of someone.
Okay, so showing ultimate respect, submission. But that seems like pretty intense for a regular gathering, even back then.
It was about acknowledging power and presence, for sure. But and here's the thing, it wasn't only for God. You could proskuneo before, like a human king or a leader too.
Oh, interesting. So it wasn't about like singing praises or anything.
Right.
Huh. Makes sense that our ideas of worship get all mixed up with music.
Definitely. And then you've got the other word, latreo, which adds a whole other layer.
Okay, I'm listening. What's latrio all about?
Latrio was all about sacrifice. You can think of it on a couple of levels. First, like literally offering animals at the temple.
Okay.
Right. But the early Christians understood it metaphorically too, like offering yourself completely to God.
Oh. Like in Romans 12.1, where Paul talks about offering your body as a living sacrifice.
Exactly. The trio in action. It's not just words, it's a whole way of life. And what Wadsworth is saying is English Bibles, even Greek dictionaries, they've missed the nuances of those words sometimes. And that's caused like centuries of confusion about what early Christian gatherings were like.
Okay, so this is getting really interesting. Those words didn't mean worship the way we understand it, and the New Testament doesn't use the expected terms for their gatherings. Why is this such a big deal for us to understand? Like, what's the overall point?
It shows a total mind shift. See, the early church was rejecting that whole temple model. Jewish and pagan, the whole thing.
It wasn't just like tweaking a few rituals, was it? This was way bigger.
Way bigger. They saw God as with them through the Holy Spirit. You see this over and over. Stephen in Acts 7 says straight up, the Most High does not dwell in houses made by human hands.
Bold statement for that time, right? Like he's challenging everything they thought was holy.
Right. Then a bit later, you've got Paul in Athens, same idea, totally different audience. To the Gentiles, he says, the God who made the world and everything in it does not dwell in temples made by hands.
So both Stephen to the Jews and Paul to the Gentiles saying, hey, those old ways of relating to God through temples, they don't apply anymore.
Exactly. And that rejection of temples, it keeps going. Barnabas, Clement of Alexandria, Origen, they all emphasize God wasn't limited to a building. He didn't need our offerings like before.
I'm seeing the contrast here. It's not a distant God in a building, it's God with them. That changes, everything about how you come together as a community.
Absolutely. Huge shift.
Okay, but if they weren't having what we think of as worship services, how did we get to where we are today? How did things change so much?
Well, It was a process. It didn't happen overnight. To really get it, we need to step back and see the historical context. These early Christians, they were living in a world surrounded by temples and sacrifices.
Yeah, that was just like the norm. So how did they break out of that? It must have been tough to go against the flow like that.
It was. But Wadsworth, he lays out this fascinating progression. See, it started in the 2nd century when some Christians began to reinterpret the Lord's Supper.
Really? The Lord's Supper?
Yeah. They started seeing it not just as remembering Christ's sacrifice, but as our sacrifice, offered to God. It became about what we were doing.
So the focus shifted from what Christ did to what we were doing right then.
Exactly. And that little shift, it had big ripple effects. The table slowly became an altar, the leader became a priest, and the building itself, well, it started to look like a temple.
Wow. So they went from rejecting temples to almost building new ones just with different labels?
It's wild how these things change, isn't it? And by the 4th century, you've got Constantine, right? Christianity's becoming mainstream, and the word worship is stuck to those gatherings for good.
We've circled all the way back to a system the early church was trying to get away from.
It makes you think, right?
Oh, right.
And it makes Wadsworth's work even more relevant for us today. We can't just ignore this stuff.
Definitely not. Speaking of which, we were getting into edification before we went down that historical rabbit hole. Such a different focus than what we're used to.
Oh, it is. And it's something the New Testament brings up again and again about these gatherings. The word for edification, that's oikodome in Greek. It literally means house building. So when they came together, it was all about strengthening each other, building each other up, like bricks in a house.
Yeah, and that goes back to what we were saying about their whole life being an act of devotion, not just something you do on Sunday morning in a building,
Yeah, living it out in a way that impacts others. And it's not some vague idea either. Paul's pretty clear about it. 1 Corinthians 14.26. He says, let all things be done for edification. That's an order, not a suggestion.
This rejection of temples, this focus on edification, makes you think, what even is sacred space? Is it just a building or is it something more? Maybe it's about God's presence with people who are committed to building each other up.
That's a great way to put it. If we were going to design a house of edification today, what would it even look like? What would we build with?
Exactly. If we really took Paul seriously, it would change everything about how we think about our gatherings, wouldn't it?
Totally. It wouldn't be about putting on a show, but about real connection, growth.
Yeah. It'd be less about passively listening and more about everyone participating,
Yeah.
Contributing.
And maybe a lot more small group stuff where people really get to know each other, support each other.
Yeah, I love that. Not just rows of chairs facing the front, but a space designed for actual conversations. Maybe even edification rooms, specifically for that.
I like that. It makes you question what a church building should be. Why are we even gathering? It's about making an environment where people can build each other up. Spiritually, emotionally, the whole thing.
It's crazy, isn't it? Scholars have known about this worship anomaly for years, this fact that the New Testament doesn't use those worship words. But we haven't really dealt with what that means for us today, like a big elephant in the room nobody wants to talk about.
Right. The meaning got lost in translation. Literally and figuratively. I think part of it is those worship wars we had back in the late 20th century.
Yeah. The rise of praise and worship music, that whole debate about what music was even allowed in church, right? Funny how that might have skewed how we understand worship now.
Totally. Think about it. All of a sudden there was this explosion of worship language everywhere. Maybe that made it even harder to see the difference between what we do now and what was happening in the New Testament.
Yeah, the word itself drowned out the real meaning of gathering as believers.
That's it. And in a way, that's why Wadsworth's work is so important. It's not just some historical trivia. He's making us rethink our assumptions, rediscover the point of coming together. Yeah, it's a call to get back to our roots, rediscover that radical simplicity and power of edification.
Totally. But before we get too carried away, there's one more piece I think we need to look at.
You're invited. Edification Gathering with APM. Are you ready to grow deeper in your faith? Join the Assembly of People in Mission, APM, for a special gathering dedicated to edification, an opportunity to strengthen our connection with God and one another. Our vision is rooted in the greatest commandment, to love Yahweh, our God, with all our heart, all our soul, and all our mind, and to love our neighbor as ourselves. Our mission is clear, the Great Commission, to go and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, and teaching them to obey everything Yeshua HaMashiach has commanded us. We believe that surely Jesus Christ is with us always to the very end of the age. Join us for this transformative gathering, online or in person. Date, time, and location. The physical address or link to the online platform, along with other details, will be available if you contact us using the number below this video. Whether you join us online or in person, we look forward to growing in faith, mission, and community together. Let's embark on this journey of edification. See you there.
We've talked about how they rejected the temple model and focused on building each other up, but there's another layer that's just as mind-blowing.
You're talking about how even prostration, like we talked about before, that wasn't something they typically did in their gatherings either.
That's it. It's huge, especially when you think how common prostration was in the first century. Showing respect and all that.
It seems weird, doesn't it? But it makes sense when you think about it. Remember, early Christians saw God as living in them through the Holy Spirit, not stuck in a building.
Right. So God was everywhere, not just in a temple.
Right. And that totally changed how they saw prostration. Like in the temple, Jewish or pagan, it was all about going to a deity in their place. You were bowing to their power in their spot.
Okay, so you prostrate before a god in their temple. It was all about the location, showing reverence in their designated place.
Exactly. But for early Christians, God wasn't confined to a temple anymore. They experienced his presence everywhere, especially with each other.
So doing that in a building would have felt kind of, pointless.
It would fell off, yeah, compared to their understanding of God being present. Instead, their proskuneo, their submission, their devotion, they lived that out every day. It was in how they loved each other, how they built each other up.
It's like their whole life became an act of worship, not just something they did in a building. Wow. Beautiful.
It is, and this is even shown in the New Testament. The only time you see someone prostrating in a Christian gathering, it's not one of the believers doing it.
No way. Who is it then?
It's someone from the outside, an unbeliever. They wander into one of these gatherings and are just completely blown away by what they experience.
Oh, is this that part in 1 Corinthians 14 where Paul describes an unbeliever walking into a gathering, everyone's prophesying, and he's just floored?
Exactly. He's so overcome by the Holy Spirit that what does he do? Falls on his face and says, God is really among you.
So he just does what he knows. Prostration. It's all he has to go on.
That's it. But the thing is, this prostration, it's not what the Christians themselves are doing. It's the reaction of someone outside the group, someone who doesn't get this new way of relating to God yet.
Fascinating. So to really rethink worship, like Wadsworth says, it's got to be more than just changing words. It's about getting back to that feeling of God's presence, that awe and wonder that inspired them to live differently.
Absolutely. It's about going beyond outward stuff and really living in a way that shows our love for God and each other.
It's about living that edification, that house building. And this isn't just history, right? This is about us.
100%. It's a challenge to look at what we assume and find that power of real community again.
It's asking hard questions like, what if our gatherings were more about building each other up than performing for God? What if sacred space wasn't limited to a building?
Good questions.
Really good questions. And that's what these deep dives are all about. Inviting you, the listener, to take these ideas and run with them, see where they go.
It's about starting a conversation, rethinking what it means to follow Christ in the 21st century.
We've gone deep today. Those Greek words, the worship service evolving, rejecting temples and focusing on edification, lots to think about. We spent a lot of time unpacking these ideas about worship and edification, but there's one more thing that's been kind of bugging me.
What?
Well, we talked about how proskuneo didn't always mean worship in the way we think of it, but I'm still a little fuzzy on why the really Christians wouldn't have prostrated themselves during their gatherings.
Yeah, it is kind of a head scratcher, right? Especially since prostration was so common back then. It was like the ultimate way to show respect.
Exactly. So why wouldn't they do that, especially if they were so focused on God?
Well, think back to what we were saying about God's presence. The early Christians didn't see God as confined to a specific place, like a temple. They believed he was with them through the Holy Spirit wherever they were.
Right. They experienced God as being everywhere.
Exactly. So for them, prostrating themselves in a building would have felt, almost meaningless.
I guess it wouldn't have made much sense to bow down in a particular spot if they believed God was present everywhere.
Right, their devotion wasn't tied to a location. Their proskuneo, their submission to God, it was expressed in their daily lives, in their actions, in how they treated each other.
It's like their whole life became an act of worship, not just something they did in a specific place or time.
That's a great way to put it. And it's really interesting when you look at how prostration is depicted in the New Testament. You know, the only time someone actually prostrates themselves during a Christian gathering, it's not even one of the believers.
Wait, who is it then?
It's this outsider, an unbeliever, who stumbles into one of their gatherings. And he's just blown away by what he sees and hears.
Oh, you're talking about that story in 1 Corinthians where Paul describes a guy walking into a meeting where everyone is prophesying.
Exactly. This guy is so overwhelmed by the presence of God, he just falls on his face and declares that God is really among them.
It's like he didn't even know how to react, so he just defaults to prostration because that's all he knows.
Right. But the point is, the Christians themselves aren't the ones doing it. It's the reaction of someone who's coming from outside the community, someone who's still stuck in that old way of thinking about God and worship.
Wow, so to really rethink worship, like Tom Wadsworth is suggesting, it's about so much more than just changing the words we use.
It's about rediscovering that sense of God's presence that was so real for the early Christians. That awe and wonder that inspired them to live differently.
It's about moving beyond outward rituals and embracing a way of life that reflects our love for God and for each other.
And you know, what strikes me is that this isn't just about history. This is about us, right here, right now.
You're so right. This conversation has really challenged me to think differently about what it means to be a follower of Christ in the 21st century.
Me too. It's a call to re-examine everything. What if our gatherings were more about building each other up and less about performing for God? What if sacred space wasn't limited to a building, but extended to every area of our lives?
Those are great questions to consider. And as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to invite you, the listener, to keep wrestling with these ideas. What resonated with you? What questions do you still have?
We've covered a lot of ground today, and I hope it sparked something in you. Maybe it's a new perspective on worship, or a desire to connect with your community in a deeper way.
Maybe it's even inspired you to think about what a house of edification would look like in your own context. Whatever it is, keep exploring, keep asking questions, and keep building each other up.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We'll see you next time.
Blessed is the one who subscribes to this channel. Remember the golden rule: treat others as you want to be treated.
As we conclude this episode of Spirituality and Society, we acknowledge and celebrate your commitment to seeking first Yahweh God's kingdom and His righteousness. May Yahweh's blessings be upon you, now and always.